Thanks for clicking on this video. This one is about faith and justice work in churches and communities. The special strength of Bread for the World is that it's supported by a really huge network of faith-based advocates and churches all across the country. So I have seen over and over again the aggregate power of grassroots advocacy, people from all over the country working together to push legislation. When Bread for the World starts a campaign, it's always daunting to try to figure out how are we going to get what we want. But then after a few months, members of Congress start expressing their support by co-sponsoring legislation or in another way. And what's happening there is that one by one, they're being swayed by their constituents back home, activists and churches, to step up for hungry people. Just last month, the House of Representatives passed a global nutrition bill. It passed with a big bipartisan majority. Another example of Bread for the World people across the country delivering change. When it passed, then the Senate said, okay, we put it on the agenda. I think by maybe September, this bill is going to become law, and it will, in fact, reduce child malnutrition around the world. I've always made it my business to get engaged in Bread for the World's activities in my own church, in my own community. I live in Alexandria, Virginia. It's really close to the capital, in fact. It's part of the metropolitan area. And my wife and I attend Christ Church in Alexandria. I want to talk about my experience in my church, and then also my experience in my community. My wife and I joined Christ Church because it was good for my family. We needed to find a place where our children were supported by children and youth programs. Christ Church had that. They had a great children's choir. That was good for my boys. And then Janet really appreciated the aesthetics of worship at Christ Church, partly because it's a beautiful old colonial church. It was the Church of George Washington, and then later the Church of Robert E. Lee. It's a historic church. Now, I wasn't all that enthusiastic at the beginning about Christ Church, partly because, ironically, the Church of George Washington was virtually allergic to talking about public policy. Important things could be happening in public policy and no word would be said within the halls of Christ Church. The rector asked me to form a faith and public policy committee, and he helped pull that together. That committee did a series of adult forums on faith and public policy. And then over time, they became more specific about issues, current issues. And they sometimes included letter writing with Bread for the World. Lots of people had the experience of writing to our congresspeople about hunger issues, domestic and international. Some of them joined Bread for the World. Some of them went to lobby days and in different ways went to see our members of Congress as advocates for hungry people. I think also the rector asked me to preach from time to time, and so I think all of that together did raise the consciousness of a lot of people in Christ Church, people there now, people who've come through, and we made a difference too. Our two senators, our representatives, they're all fairly progressive people. They're interested in the kinds of things Bread for the World is doing. But progressive or not, there are a lot of different things that members of Congress can focus on. And I think our advocacy helped to get them to focus on some things that would be good for hungry people. Also, I think we could call their attention to specific things they could do, like co-sponsoring a piece of legislation. And there's so much going on in Congress that members of Congress really need their constituents to call their attention to ways that they can help move an issue forward. I think one shortcoming that we still have is that we've really failed to institutionalize public policy advocacy in Christ Church. It's still pretty much that I've got to push, I've got to take an initiative, I've got to suggest something to make something happen. Other people are glad to help. But actually before COVID, we were talking about ways to institutionalize this, to connect it to the other outreach and mission activities of the church. That got interrupted, and now that COVID's tapering off, we've got to get back to trying to institutionalize public policy advocacy in the church. I want to mention that Christ Church has become more progressive, but mainly because of a couple other things that have happened. First, when the Episcopal Church welcomed gay and lesbian people as priests and bishops, that provoked a lot of controversy. We had lots of discussions involving all the members of the church. I think the best thing about those discussions was that a number of people felt free to talk about their own sexuality in church for the very first time. We decided to stick with the Episcopal Church. Quite a few families left. That had budgetary impacts for us. There were tough budgets for several years. But then over time, our church has been joined by quite a few LGBTQ people. And I think just generally, we're a more welcoming church than we were before we went through that process. Another big thing happened when there was a far-right protest in Charlottesville. It was in the national news, Charlottesville, Virginia. There was violence, somebody got killed. And at that point, then the leadership of the church said, you know, it's time for us to move the plaques in front of the church. Soon after the Civil War, the church put up plaques honoring Robert E. Lee and George Washington, kind of co-fathers of the nation. And they have flanked the altar of Christ Church ever since. Some people don't feel welcome seeing a plaque of Robert E. Lee right up by the altar. And so, again, we went through a long process of discussion. Everybody was heard. A few people quit, but mostly not. Mostly we decided, it was time to move those plaques to the educational wing of the church, to a museum-type space. We got criticized by Fox News. President Trump himself criticized Christ Church. The rector got hate calls for several months. Police protected all of our services. But that decision was the beginning of a really valuable program of racial justice education. It's been good for me, my family, friends, transformative for some of the people I know. Let me now talk a little bit about my experience at the community level. There was an activist named Steve Ruth who organized a Bread for the World group for all of Northern Virginia. That's 3 congressional districts. And the main thing he did was open his home. He invited us all to come to his home He served Oreos, coffee, juice. And once a month we got together at Steve's home. But getting that group together regularly led to, first we organized a number of big events. So more churches got involved, more people got involved in Bread for the World. Also, when we met, we strategized. So we thought especially about, well, how do we get to those members of Congress from Northern Virginia who are not yet supporting us on this issue? And we figured out ways to, who did we know, what church could be involved, might get involved. And we were successful in that. And what I noticed after a couple of years of that kind of work, that when Bread for the World introduced new legislation, all three of our members of Congress of the House were on it right away. They all signed up right away as co-sponsors. They didn't want to be asked. They wanted to be among the first, so that when people wrote to them, that they could say, "Oh yeah, I'm a co-sponsor of that." The other thing I think that was good about having a community group like that, from my experience, is that we enjoyed each other and we encouraged each other. Later, there was Melanie Gray, who's director of outreach and mission for Christ Church, was one of the people who helped pull together Hunger-Free Alexandria, a hunger-free community coalition right here in my own town. The Alliance to End Hunger, which is an affiliate of Bread for the World, the secular affiliate, supports hunger-free community organizations all across the country. And so it was just wonderful to see how it unfolded in Alexandria. The group started by commissioning a study of hunger in Alexandria, which showed that churches and charities many of them were giving food to needy people in Alexandria. We have a lot of hunger. But it also showed that, in fact, most of those feeding activities were not in the part of Alexandria where most of the low-income people live. And so several churches got together and they organized a food distribution site on the west side of Highway 395. The study also showed that the national nutrition programs, SNAP food assistance, the school lunch program, those are the biggest ones, that those programs provide much, much more food for people who need help than all the churches and charities combined. At least 10 times as much food. And so the coalition has become a place where churches and charities can meet together with people from the relevant city government departments, sometimes with state officials, federal officials, and by connecting the governmental programs with the church and charity programs, both sets of programs have become more effective. Finally, now that I'm at Virginia Theological Seminary, I have a new opportunity to work in Northern Virginia from that point of view. I was surprised, actually, that Senator Kane agreed to come to Virginia Theological Seminary for a 2-hour event. And then he hung around afterwards to talk to people from across Northern Virginia who came to hear him. Just this week, I was able to get meetings with senior staff for Kane and Senator Warner, our other senator, for the Circle of Protection. We want to talk to them about the important poverty provisions that are hanging fire right now. They really ought to get these things done before the July 4th recess. I was able to get those 2 meetings, and I think one reason why I got them pretty easily is because I'm now based at Virginia Theological Seminary. So let me conclude just with a few lessons. One is that people who do this kind of work, faith and justice work in a church, in a community, they deserve a lot of respect because it's impactful, but also really difficult. It's tough. It's fun to work with people, but it is also tough to organize people around issues of faith and justice. Second, we can, from my own experience, I've seen that we can make a difference in our democracy. Sometimes it's harder to see the difference that we're making from the perspective of one church than it is when you're looking in the aggregate at a movement of people in churches across the country. And we can make the most difference when we reach out to our senators, our representative, our city government officials, the people we help to elect. And then finally, although I hate conflict in churches, if there's a justice issue, sometimes it needs to be raised. And if it's handled lovingly, and there's a little bit of conflict, that conflict can end up making the church more lively and more Christ-like.